Hi guys, welcome to the Classes Corner. I'm Kat, and this week I'm going to be talking about Beauty and the Beast and Cupid and Psyche. So with the new live-action Disney Beauty and the Beast that's just come out recently, I felt the need to talk about Beauty and the Beast and the origins of the Beauty and the Beast fairy tale. And when you're talking about origins of fairy tales, it does get really tricky because there can be so many different versions and sort of half versions of different stories running around, especially when the stories are sort of based on similar cultural experiences, and especially when you have the amount of oral storytelling that goes into them, you get lots of different versions and it's really hard to track down where the idea of some of these stories came from. Beauty and the Beast is quite interesting because there is a sort of written, we would call a sort of written A version canonical story of the Beauty and the Beast as we would recognise it. Obviously it does come from a fairy tale, so stories there are lots of different versions, but we would consider the version written by Madame Gabrielle Suzanne de Villeneuve as the canonical Beauty and the Beast version, like we would consider the Grimm's brothers and Cinderella, for example. So her story was written either at the end of the 17th century or beginning of the 18th century, and it's quite different from the Disney version that you guys probably would be quite familiar with. So for example, the reason why the Beast is cursed, his servants not being like dancing household objects but actually sort of these invisible magical beings, and then the role of Belle's two sisters, and yeah, she has two sisters in that version, also like three brothers, but they're not really that interesting, that fill the sisters fill the role of sort of the evil stepsisters from other fairy tales. So it is quite different, and that version has been adapted hundreds of times. Quite notably, there is the 1946 film by a man called Jean Cocteau, who I've actually talked about on this channel a long time ago. I did a sort of overview of his film Orphée because that man loved himself some classics. So I've talked about that and I'll put that video in the link in my description. So, and then that movie sort of inspired some of the Disney version, and then obviously the Disney version has come out again now as the live action version of that story. So there is sort of a direct chain of influence. And well, what does that all have to do with ancient Greece or Rome or, you know, classics? The thing I talk about on this corner. Well, a lot of people would argue, and there's quite a lot of academic points going around, that Madame Gabrielle's version was inspired by a Roman story of Cupid and Psyche. And Cupid and Psyche is a secondary narrative in the story called The Metamorphoses by Apuleius, also known as the Golden Ass, which is about a man who gets turned into a donkey and has all these adventures. And during one of these adventures he hears the story of Cupid and Psyche, which Cupid and Psyche is a story about a beautiful young woman, the daughter of a king and a queen, who has these two sisters, and she's so beautiful, she's the most beautiful girl in the land, and then someone calls her more beautiful than the goddess Venus, who is, you know, the Roman version of Aphrodite, and that's a bad thing. Never a good thing. Bad thing. So Venus gets really annoyed, and she gets to her son Cupid to say, oh, this girl can be the most beautiful, fine, but no one will ever love her. And then Cupid makes that happen, but then in the meantime he actually falls in love with Psyche himself. And I just have to say that this Cupid is the grown man Cupid, put the picture there, and not the little boy Cupid, not the little cherub baby thing. So just saying, grown man Cupid. Anyway, so he falls in love with her, and then no other man falls in love with her, and she doesn't get married. Her two sisters get married off, Psyche doesn't. And her parents, they go to an oracle to say, why is no one asking for our daughter's hand? And the oracle says, you've offended the gods, Psyche has to be sacrificed to a monster. So they are upset, but they do this, and they leave her on this rock, and she gets flown away, and actually, instead of being eaten by a horrible monster, she wakes up in a beautiful palace filled with invisible servants. And they tend her every need, and basically she has been married off to this monster who's actually Cupid. But he's always in the dark and she never actually sees what he's like, so to her he seems like this monster. And eventually they sort of fall in love, they have a wedding night, and she's really happy in her palace with the servants. It's all very rich and Cupid does Cupid things, but they never see her. He never sees her. No, she never sees him, and he actually makes her promise that she can never try and find out what he actually looks like. And again, she doesn't actually know she's married to the god Cupid. So eventually she's like, oh, I really want to see my sisters. I haven't seen them in such a long time. I want to see my sisters. So he's like, yeah, go. And then she describes her wonderful life to them, and basically they're like, oh, find out what your husband looks like. So she breaks her promise and she finds out that it's Cupid, and her finding out, like her sneaking a look at him, actually hurts him. Then Venus gets involved. She didn't like Psyche to begin with, so she makes her do a bunch of tasks basically, which is actually similar to other fairy tales, like some versions of Cinderella and Rumpelstiltskin, where the heroine has to do a bunch of fiddly tasks and she gets supernatural help with them. And basically, happily ever after, Cupid and Psyche reunite and they have a daughter called Soul. So love and the mind, which is Psyche in Greek, it creates the soul. And from there you can see quite a lot of similarities between Beauty and the Beast and Cupid and Psyche. Enough so that lots of people think that one has directly influenced the other, that Cupid and Psyche is a version of the Beauty and the Beast way back when in Roman times. I am not 100% sure on that. I think lots of different cultural influences can come in, and I do think it's very, very similar though. So definitely some influence can be assumed, potentially. So what does this actually mean? Well, what it means is that stories can go from one thing to another, and it's actually quite interesting because The Golden Ass, the novel with this comes from, is not that classically significant, it would seem. It has a lot of really interesting ideas, so it has a lot of information about sort of how 2nd century Roman peasants lived, oddly enough, and it has a lot of information on mystery cults of the 2nd century AD, and it's just a really interesting story, and there's loads of Platonic symbolism and metaphor going on there. It's really interesting. It is absolutely not suitable for children. I do have to say, there's some really adult only stuff in this novel, so if you are under sort of an age where, you know, sex and violence is not appropriate, then do not read this book. Wait till you're older. If you are interested in classics and you are that little bit older, do read it. It is really cool, but it's not what people would call high classic. But if there is a direct line from Cupid and Psyche to Beauty and the Beast, the Madame Gabrielle de Villeneuve one, then Cupid and Psyche just comes from this weird little secondary narrative in this novel that makes that novel literally one of the most influential classical texts of our time, of all time basically. It creates this story where it gets Beauty and the Beast from, it gets direct Disney material from, and I find that really cool that something seemingly fairly inconsequential becomes one of the most influential pieces of media of all time. So yeah, I find that really cool. So if you guys have any other ideas of fairy tales or classics, message me in the comments below. Put your thoughts in the comments, message me on my Tumblr, and I'll put a link to everything in my description, including the Jean Cocteau video. So I will talk to you guys next week with a different topic, and I will see you then. And if you like this video, please like, share, and subscribe. So bye guys!